Hey guys, welcome back into the episode of our Docker certification. In this episode, we are going to explore one of the key concepts of the Docker, which is called port binding. So before we go take a deeper look into the port binding, we need to understand a few basic fundamentals behind that. So by default, when you bring up a container, the containers can make connection to the outside world. That means they can go ahead and connect to any other device in your network if there is a proper routing set up, and they can even also go ahead and go to the internet if you want to do that. But on the other hand, the other direction is not true by default. So what do I mean by that? That means if you want to communicate to your Docker from the outside, you will not be able to go ahead and do that. That means the incoming connection from the outside world to the Docker is not enabled by default. And if you really want from the outside world to communicate to your Docker or to your Docker container, you would need to do something called port binding. And that's what we're going to go ahead and explore in this episode. So before we go ahead and do some hands-on, let's understand that with the help of a diagram. So hopefully you can see that on my screen. Let me just zoom it up a little bit. So this big picture diagram here, it says a Docker host machine. This is the machine running your Docker engine or the Docker server. On this machine, we will go ahead and bring up a couple of containers. And so far we have been working with the Nginx as the image. So we'll go ahead and bring up two Nginx based containers. And when you run an Nginx based container, by default, they expose a port 80. But this port 80 is only accessible onto this container. From outside, we will not be able to access this port. And if we want to access this port 80 onto our, let's say on web 1, we would need to do something called port binding. So in the case of port binding, we will go ahead and pick a available port or a free port on our Docker host, and we will go ahead and map that port to the container port. That means if anybody wants to communicate with this web 1, they can send that traffic to this Docker host machine IP or hostname followed by this port. So in this case, the port is 8080. When the traffic hits the port 8080, the traffic will be forwarded to this instance of web 1, which is running an Nginx page image, to the port 80. Similarly, we can go ahead and create a couple more containers. And if you see for the second example, we are planning to use port 8081. And when any traffic comes to port 8081, that will get forwarded to the second container, port 80. And that's the whole concept behind the port binding. So that's how we can go ahead and allow the outside connections to communicate with our containers. And all the thanks goes to the port binding. So let's go ahead and take a look with the hands-on exercise. So if I quickly go back, and you can see on our box on our Docker host, right now there is one container, and the name of this container is a web1. It has been up for a while, and there are a couple images on our box. Right now there is an image by name Nginx, and we have another image by name busybox. So now let's go ahead and create a container as per the diagram that we saw. So we will be calling them web 1 and web 2, and we will be forwarding web 1 port internal port 80 to our host port 8080. So let's go ahead and do that. So as usual, we have been making use of the docker run command. So we'll go ahead and say docker run. We want to create a container, or we want to run a container. Let's give it a name to this container using that -- name flag, and let's call it web 2. And again, we will go ahead and run that in detach mode, and we'll assign a TTY. Don't worry if it's not making sense. We will go ahead and explore this D and T in a little bit greater detail in some of the upcoming videos. And now we'll go ahead and say here -p. The -p here is saying, okay, hey, we are interested in doing a port binding. Now when you do the port binding, so we are saying 8081. So the first portion on the left hand side that we configure, this is the port on our Docker host. So if we quickly go back to the diagram, I'm saying, okay, hey, port 8081. So this is the port on our Docker host, and that is being written here 8081. So now let's go ahead and change it to 8080 because we want to map 8081 to web 2. So now we are saying, okay, let me just change the name also. We are keeping in line with our picture. So I'm saying web 1, the port 8080 is being mapped with the colon 80. So what this whole thing is saying, okay, hey, we are planning to create a container. The name of this container is web 1. On that web 1 container, we have port 80, and we want that port 80 to be mapped to port 8080 on our Docker host. That means from outside, anybody should be able to access. And this is going to this container will be based on our Nginx image. So let's go ahead and simply run that. Okay, looks like there is a container. So we'll go ahead and maybe we have a container already in this box, looks like. So let's verify that. We can go ahead and do ls-a. And if you remember, we can see there is a container by name web1 here. So we can just simply go ahead and delete that container. Hopefully you remember how to delete a container. For that, the command is docker container rm and followed by the container name or the container image. So in this case, let's call it a web1. And now let's verify if that container got successfully removed or not. So we'll say docker container ls-a. And now we don't have docker container by name web1 anymore. Now let's just simply go ahead and try creating our container again. So we are creating container by name web1 based on Nginx image. And we are saying, okay, hey, forward the port on our Docker host 8080 to this container port 80. Now let's just simply go ahead and do that. And if you remember, this is the UUID of our container, which is the unique ID. And now if you go ahead and verify docker container ls, and we should have a container by web name web1. And if you look at the column which says ports here, this column is really indicating on the left hand side, it says 0000. That means any available IP address on this host, and we are mapping port 8080 on this host to the port 80 inside our container. Now there are a few other things before we bring up the second container. Let's verify a few things. If you remember, we had used the docker inspect command. So we'll say docker inspect and followed by the name of this container. I'll go ahead and say web1. And now just simply go ahead and press enter here. So if you see, this has went ahead, gave a couple of the output here. If you take a look at it, one of the section here, it says ports. It clearly says, okay, hey, the host port IP here is the docker host IP address. In this case, it says 0000 and the host port is 8080. So we are saying, hey, this container's port 80 is being mapped on our Docker host port 8080. And the IP address of our Docker container is 172.17.0.3. And obviously this will not be accessible outside. And that is the whole reason we are mapping the port 80 on our Docker host, because this IP of the Docker host is accessible on our network. So that way, when somebody is sending a request to our Docker host, IP followed by port 8080, it's being forwarded to this IP and this particular port 80. Just to explain again, 00 indicates all the available IP address on this host. Our host has a couple of available IP address. If I do ifconfig and pass it to ls, and if you see, I can go ahead and send a request to this IP address on port 8080, or I can also go ahead and make use of the IPv6 address on this host, and I can also go ahead and do 8080. So that's the whole idea behind 00. That means all the available IP addresses on this host. Now if I go ahead and run the command docker container ls again, so we are saying, okay, hey, on our Docker host, port 8080 is being mapped to the port 80 inside the container. That means if I go to our host IP address and port 8080, the traffic will be forwarded to this container web1 onto the port 80. And now let's go ahead and verify that. We can go back to our browser and let me go ahead and type the IP address and followed by the port number 8080. Now let's just simply go, and you can see we are being presented welcome to Nginx. That means on our Docker host, when we said 8080, now that traffic is being forwarded to this container's port 80. Now let's go ahead and similarly bring one more container based on our diagram. In this case, we will go ahead and create one more container by name web2, and we'll go ahead and forward the port 8081 on our Docker host to the port 80 on this particular container. So now just simply go ahead and do the command docker run. Now let's call it web2, and we're going to map the port here 8081 to the port 80 inside that container, and it will be based on the Nginx image. And let me go ahead and specify -dnt also. Now you can see the system is printing the UUID. So now let's just simply go ahead and docker container ls again. Now we have one more container by name web2, and in this case you can see the port 8081 on our Docker host is being forwarded to port 80 onto this container. Now as we have been saying, okay, hey, this port on the Docker host. So when the port forwarding happens, we can also verify this port on the Docker host itself. So I can go ahead and say here netstat-ntlp, and we are looking for two port here, 8080 and 8081. So now let me just go ahead and simply do that. So we will go ahead and say netstat-ntlp, and let me go ahead and press enter here. And you would see the port 8080 and you would see a port 8081. So that'll be all for this quick episode. In the next episode, we will go ahead and explore a few more options. Thank you.